We made it, finally. Sorry for the delay for our live viewers. That was less than impressive, guaranteed. When you want to do something new, something big, something with a nice, huge impression, technology is always going to fail you. Welcome to the FW Word. Chance to look at a topic from history, the modern world, current affairs, without shying away from the controversial. Whether you're watching live on Twitch or after the fact on YouTube, your views... Hey, thank you for the host, Mr. Bonky. Your views are what makes the show. So get involved, make yourself heard. The rules for discussion are at the bottom of the screen. But to be clear, this isn't a chance to put your view ahead of everyone else's, or beat people down with it. Be respectful. Understand that people might have a different opinion than you do, and be ready to put your views across, hopefully without attacking anyone else. As host, my aim is to bring all sides into view, and avoid telling you what to think. That's up to you, surprisingly. I'm going to start with an introduction of today's topic, and then we'll explore it from a variety of angles. So if you're watching live, and you want to put forward an interesting topic or a question in the live chat here on Twitch, it could be selected to appear on the screen. If I can get my hands right, it is that way. Over there. Oh, my finger's gone. Today, the first FW word, we're going to be taking a deeper look at nationalism. So we'll get going. Do put your questions, comments, etc. into live chat. If you're watching the recorded version, comments are always welcome on YouTube. We'll start off with what I call human tribalism, which is the idea that humans and primates are not well equipped to live alone. There have been hermits in the case of humanity, but most humans live in groups, and most primates live in groups as well. We came from primates, according to Darwin and most of the research since. The size of a primate brain, research suggests, is linked to the size of the group that it can maintain. Alright, so it's not quite understood, but it's suggested that as the primate brain develops, the larger the social group that primate can maintain. It kind of makes sense, you know, if you have a very small brain, you won't be able to cope, you won't be able to know everybody in your group, you know. And as we developed from primates, the group size increased. As brains developed, human brains developed larger and larger, we were able to unite with more and more people. But of course, we're talking about a long time ago, prior to agriculture. So we were all living, not me personally, not you. You weren't around at the time, I hope. Unless it's something that you know, I don't. But prior to agriculture, humans were living in nomadic groups or tribes. And, you know, they lived off the land. They just sort of foraged, hunted, whatever was the going thing at the time. And then around 10,000 years ago, the invention of agriculture allowed humans to settle on land they would later call home. So that was really the start of the human tribal unit, if you like, uniting itself with a common piece of land. You know, before that, everybody would have moved around. There would have been no notion that people owned a piece of land or an area, and people would have just carried on moving around where the food was, you know? 10,000 years, though, since the formation of agriculture, it's not a great deal of time in terms of evolution. So the notion of tribalism is still part of the human brain, you know? It takes longer than that to evolve away from that kind of notion. Maybe in the future we'll evolve into something else. Who knows? Some kind of alien life forms, I don't know. But 10,000 years. I mean, it's roughly 10,000, not exactly like, 10,000 years right now. It's not long enough. So we're still stuck with that in our brains today. So examples of modern tribalism, I know Twitch will like this one. PC gamers versus console gamers. Like, what difference does it make? You know, like if someone else is playing their game on a console and you're playing on a PC, or vice versa, what difference does that make to you? You know, you don't even, until they speak up about it, you don't even know that they're playing on a console. Some random guy on the internet, but you feel like it's kind of your obligation to defend your tribe, whether your tribe is the PC gamers or whether your tribe is the console generation, Xbox or PlayStation. You know, do add your question in chat. Yeah, please go for it, Mr. Bonky. That would be great. And I will get through this introduction and then we'll have a look at some of these questions. Hopefully they will be appearing on screen. Mr. Bonky's in charge of that today, so big thanks to Mr. Bonky for stepping up and offering to maintain the chat and hopefully some sense of order down there. Sports teams and their fans. So we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail later on. But you can definitely get a sense of tribalism from sports. You know, these guys are inferior to us because they support that team and we're fans of this team, you know? Even down to joining a group when you buy a product, you know? I'm not talking about like buying a pint of milk or even a beer, you know? This is more down to when you buy, say you buy a Mac or an iPhone. It tends to be kind of a collective of Macintosh iPhone users. You know, you get an iPhone and you feel like you're part of the community because you have this device and certain other people don't have it. Another example, political parties. So, yeah, politics is always a contentious subject, not something we necessarily have to avoid, unlike most of Twitch chat. I'm not going to shy away from political discussion because it's all part of this whole larger thing. Political parties are, you know, a kind of a tribe, I suppose. You join because you have the same ideals, the same beliefs, and occasionally can lead to heated debate and sometimes even conflict. That's a very, very short introduction. I'm going to look at some more specific examples, and then, interestingly, Mr. Bonky has asked, should patriotism and nationalism be seen as the same? And if not, what are the differences? That's actually a topic on my list, so I'm going to postpone answering that one until we get to that stage. So, great question, thank you. And we will definitely get to that. He says, personally, I believe people mostly root for what they feel comfortable with, even if there are better options. So that's an interesting point, one we can deal with right now. This is just straight out of the chat. Yeah. So humans, we are conditioned to have a fear of the unknown, you know? If we know a product or a thing better than something that we don't know, most people are likely to favour that thing, even if it's not seen as the rational or the best possible choice, you know? It's an interesting point, and not one that I'd considered running up to this show. But you're quite right. I feel most comfortable with the stuff I have around me, in terms of, we're sticking with technology as an example, but if I move to other technology, it would take me time to learn. And the same is true of a line of thought, you know, ideology. If you have a certain ideology, someone introduces you to a new one, the temptation can be just to reject it. But this is what I'm going to be advocating here. I'm going to try and stay away from my own personal opinions, but open-mindedness is a huge part of, I think, what makes us so productive in today's world, you know. You might have a certain belief, someone might come up to you with another belief, you might think it's total crap, right? It might well be total crap, but what's the harm in hearing it out, you know? You might surmise, after listening carefully, that it is total crap, but at least you listened, you know? Didn't just dismiss it. So, I think overcoming our fear of the unknown and taking on new points of view is really part of the same kind of thing. Trying to move past this idea that, you know, I've always done things this way. therefore it must be the best, you know? Moving on to a specific example, Stanford prison experiment. You might have heard of this. In 1971, August 1971, there was a psychological experiment Stanford conducted by Professor Philip Zimbardo, using some college students. And what happened was the students were split into two groups, right? So you had prison guards and you had prisoners. And Zimbardo was acting as the superintendent, so the prison guards were reporting to him. I just want you to imagine that for a second. It's everyone knows it's an experiment, you know. Nobody thought they were actual prisoners, and nobody thought that they were actual prison guards. It was just an experiment. It lasted 6 days. It was supposed to last a lot longer, but it only lasted 6 days because things got out of hand pretty quickly. And, you know, these people really took on their roles. The prison guards showed, you know, excessive violence in some cases, trying to control the prisoners. And in the end, it was shut down because it became too real, in a way. It's not directly related to tribalism, don't get me wrong, but it does show the levels that humans would go to in order to enforce an assigned role. And it holds true throughout psychological experiments like this, where people are artificially put into groups. They will quickly adopt the role that they're assigned, you know, work together with others that have been designated within the same group, and disagree perhaps irrationally with people in another group purely just because they are in another group. And it seems to be just a part of human nature to do that. But a lot of what we've developed as humans is a way of overcoming human nature. And I think that's what we need to focus on today. Another one from Mr. Bonky. People often associate nationalism with Nazism. Interesting. Do you believe it should stay like this in education? Or should they dig deeper, looking at how much nationalism is bad? Another one that I'll come on to in a little bit. So these are really good questions, but if I'm already going to go into these later on in the show, I'm going to stay away from those topics just for now. At least that's how it is here in Denmark. So Mr. Bonky's from Denmark. Obviously, border territory to what would have been Nazi Germany, so you can understand the nature of that question. Let's move on and talk about something called Dunbar's number. So this was a piece of research done by Robin Dunbar at the University of Liverpool. And the conclusion is that human brain can maintain connections of up to 150 people. So, although you probably know the names of more than 150 people in your life, the suggestion is that you're not going to be able to maintain a close or even, you know, familiar relationship with more than 150. And there's been a lot of research into this. That was the most famous study, but other research has come up with different numbers, but they've all been in the 150 sort of area, which is really interesting, because it means that although you might associate yourself with a tribe, I'm using the term tribe loosely here, it could mean nation, you know, there's no way that you can know everybody unless your nation is 150 people, and there's not many of those, you know. You can't know enough about those people on a daily basis to maintain a strong relationship with all of them. And that's science speaking. I mean, you might disagree, but that's the suggestion, at least. So that all leads on to early nationalism, and it's time to define this thing. Nationalism is deliberately kind of a loose word. It means different things to different people. Generally means giving preference to one's own country over other countries, or people from one's country to those outside of that country. Could also mean love for one's country, but like I said, a very loose definition, And we're never going to completely agree on exactly what nationalism is, or even how I should pronounce it, according to me. So early governments. This is the interesting bit. Early governments dominated by monarchs or similar rulers. Take the Roman Empire, for example. 27 BC. This is before even Jesus Christ, you know. Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, and he was supreme leader. Interestingly, before that, Rome was a republic, you know. Very different way of operating. So the English and later the British monarchy as well, another example of a strong monarchy, and the Holy Roman Empire, which had an emperor and then was ruled by, you know, subordinates of that emperor, different nation states. So at that time, citizens would be living under the rule of their leader, and they don't have a huge opportunity to decide upon what affairs are important to them, or have opinions outside of the monarchy, or whoever's ruling, or the religion of the state, which played a large part in the times of centuries ago. Spanish Inquisition, good example. You will be Catholic, or we'll come and get you. You know, you were not free hundreds of years ago to decide what you should think. Another example, Galileo, deciding that maybe the church is wrong about all of this stuff to do with astronomy, because I've looked at it, I've done a scientific analysis. He was not treated too well. You know, you can't disagree as just a regular guy or gal in those sort of times. France, interestingly, France prior to the French Revolution had an absolute monarch, and thus came up with this concept of the three estates. Okay, so the monarch was basically the leader of everybody, and when I say absolute monarch, I mean absolute monarch is what he says goes, and a lot of early monarchies were like this. Britain, interestingly, adopted a different system, or England, as it would have been at the time, adopted a different system where there was a parliament, you know, and they got to decide things and limited the power of the monarchy. But France, what the king said went, you know. The clergy were part of this thing called the first estate. The nobility were the second estate, and commoners, everyone else, the third estate. So if you're a member of religion, you are seen as the highest of the high, except for the monarch. Nobility, which was hereditary, you know. If you were born into nobility, you were a noble. There wasn't necessarily an easy way to go from being a peasant farmer to being a noble. Could happen. Probably wouldn't, you know. There was no kind of American dream in those days where you can work your way up. And then commoners, which was the vast majority of people, were the third estate. And again, it suppresses individualism, individual thinking. This is all really pre the idea of nationalism. Mr. Bonky says, do you think nationalism exists among people who claim that they oppose it? What I mean with this is, do people feel a love for their country without associating it with nationalism? Well, I'll throw that back at you, Mr. Bonky. What do you think? I might answer that in more detail when we get the lowdown from Mr. Bonky, because that's a really good question as well. Schiff's here. Welcome in the live chat to Schiff. Welcome. Schiff being German, obviously going to be he's going to be having some strong opinions on this, no doubt. So we move on to the American Revolution of around 1765, which culminated in the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, in 1776. And that kind of paved the way of allowing a new style of rule, because these people were all sick of being under British rule, you know. They didn't want to be paying taxes to the king. They wanted to do things their own way, and they wanted their own independence. And it was actually kind of relatively unheard of at the time, you know? And the French Revolution led on from that, 1789 onwards, disrupting the power of the absolute monarch, disrupting the position of his head on his shoulders as well. Good old Louis XVI. It was pretty messy. And it led to a series of wars. Napoleon rose to power after the French Revolution. But it did lay the foundation for what we think of as modern governments now. I mean, a true democracy in the 16th century would have been pretty much unheard of. A true democracy today could argue that we're a little bit closer to that. Coming back to that earlier question now, Mr. Bonky says, I personally believe a lot of people do still have a nationalistic belief even though they claim to oppose it. I have, at several occasions, he says, discussed nationalism with friends and teachers alike, often asking the question, do you love your country? With most of them answering yes. So what I have to ask there is, do you love your country at the expense of another country? That's the question we should be asking, you know? Do you say, this is the best country? These other countries, they suck. Or do you just say, you know, we're doing pretty well here? That's the difference for me. And I think there are divisions amongst populations in terms of, yeah, we're openly nationalistic. We know what nationalism is. We understand it. To people who are openly nationalistic, don't really get what it means. Don't really get its impact. To people that are, no, I'm not nationalistic, but still exhibit the signs. Yeah, absolutely. And then you get people who are opposed to it, don't really understand why. Just someone's told them to be opposed to it. And you get people who are more in the know who are opposed to it. And then you get the last group, which is people who are more open-minded, I suppose, and on the fence about all this. So, following the rise of power of Napoleon, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved in 1806. Out goes the emperor of a very large, or what was at one time a very large section of Europe. But you have to remember at the time, the era of colonialism was in full swing. I'm going to use the British Empire because it's obviously a subject I know quite a bit about, but the British Empire controlled huge territories across the world. And so did France, so did Holland, so did Spain, so did certain other countries, perhaps to lesser extents. But these are all examples, what I've given so far, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the aftermath of the French Revolution. These are bloody revolutions. You know, people lost their heads, people died in wars, in executions, conflict in general. But is fighting for your beliefs the answer? That's the question. Haven't there been more examples in history of peaceful revolution? Now I'm thinking about Gandhi in India, who was famously non-violent, peaceful protests. He was, I mean, not necessarily all of his followers. And Martin Luther King as well, another famous example, the struggle for black rights. What other examples of revolution have we seen in recent times or times past that have happened without bloodshed? And is it more effective to have a revolution without combat, without killing? Is it possible? I mean, I certainly think that we've shown that it is possible, but is it likely to happen or not? Schiff raises a good point. Indian independence wasn't really that peaceful. So this is the idea that it can be done peacefully, which is Gandhi's idea. If Gandhi had, you know, let's put it this way, his ideal was a peaceful revolution. What happened in India was obviously quite terrible. There was a lot of conflict after independence, and now we have the countries of Pakistan and Bangladesh, as a result, mainly split down religious lines. We're actually going to stay away from religion for this topic. I mean, do talk about it, it's fine, but it doesn't really come into the subject of nationalism. The German Peaceful Revolution, says Schiff, in 1989 is a great example. Yeah, so 1989. Germany, Berlin in particular, was split down the middle. Well, it was, yeah, it's kind of a weird split. Have a look at a map of East and West Germany at the time, and one thing strikes you, and that is that Berlin wasn't really in West Germany, even though it was down as part of, well, half of it was down as part of West Germany. It was kind of split. But yeah, people decided they had enough, and we'll be coming onto that subject in a little bit more detail later on. Mr. Bonky says, I have a certain bias for Scandinavian and Western European countries. Of course, Mr. Bonky from Denmark is one of the Scandinavian countries, and I believe them to be the equals of Denmark, for lack of a better word. This comes from looking at Eastern Europe and seeing their poverty, at least compared to the rest of Europe. Okay. So when you say bias, what do you mean? Do you think Scandinavia is a better place to live, or do you think it's full of people who are better than Eastern Europeans, or government that's better than Eastern Europe, or you know, what does this bias entail? An interesting question. He also goes on to say, in Denmark, when we became democracy, we had a peaceful change, but that was because our king at the time was not opposing it. Mostly he was a bit lazy, and a little afraid of what happened in France. Yeah, so we're coming on to the rise of nationalism in just a moment. So it's time to put forward one of my notions of modern nationalism. And I think it starts innocently enough, you know. I think you can see it as an effort for people to unite under a common ideology and make their own territory a better place. You know, simple as that. It might come from a fear of invasion, other nations, or the desire to protect your borders. You know, there were a lot of wars in Europe. There have been a lot of wars in Europe. Territories have been overthrown by different, well, countries and leaders, nation states, for hundreds of years. So isn't it only fair to want to protect what's yours and what you see as yours by virtue of this line on a map? Mr. Bonky says, I believe Scandinavia is a better place together, usually with a less corrupt government. So that's a superiority argument, isn't it? Saying that this place is a better place to live than another place. But what makes it so? Okay, so if you split that down and say, well, the government's less corrupt, is there any corruption in Scandinavian government? Is it the perfect system? Could it be improved? And can you think of any examples of governments that work better than those of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark? The whole world should be Britain, says Mulhernator, in his usual troll fashion. Welcome to Mulhernator in the live chat. Don't forget, if you have a key point or question you'd like to raise, you can get it on... That's the wrong hand. You can get it in this box over here. Moderator will be choosing which comments and questions go in that box. So Germany, in the 19th century, nationalism originally came from a sense of liberalism, from liberal thinkers at the time. But it was to some extent down to the regard for other bordering nations like France, I use bordering loosely, and England as weak and inferior. The culmination of which, of course, was a certain Mr. Hitler and the Second World War. So, examining that in a little bit more detail. Deus Vult, says High Priest. No, nothing to do with nationalism. Pope Urban and all that. The Danish system could definitely be improved, says Mr. Bonky. We've had a few tax problems lately, some dodgy political parties. Yeah, so I think it comes down to, are we doing the best we can do, you know? So, obviously Hitler, very charismatic leader, everybody knows who Hitler was. He was able to hold sway over an impoverished Germany after the First World War. And that's a key point, really, is that the more desperate people are, the more willing they are to listen to people in power with charisma. Whether that message is right or wrong, looking back, how many of those people who participated in the Nazi Party thought that the outcome would be as it was when they joined? How many people were just swept along, How many people thought, well, can't beat them, so to join them, And in the 1930s, the early 1930s, when Hitler and his party first came to power, it wasn't a hugely extremist party. That kind of developed later on, Schiff said Hitler had the goal to unite all ethnic Germans, which is more racist than it is actually nationalist. Yes, exactly. So Hitler's belief was that the Germanic people, and this includes Austria, this includes areas of what was then Czechoslovakia and Switzerland as well. Hello to Thready3030, who has turned up in the live chat. Thanks for joining. Feel free to get involved if you like. We are discussing nationalism. A very controversial topic indeed. But I think in today's world we've probably overcome that. The idea that certain genes make you a superior human being to other human beings. At the time, less was understood. People were still measuring the size of other people's heads and the shape of their heads to work out if they had a superior nature or not, Eugenics was this great scientific revolution where, I say great in inverted commas, where everybody can suddenly breed super children and we can be free of disease and be morally and racially superior to everybody else. That's not even part of today's thinking, in the Western world, at least. Mr. Bonky says, Danish nationalism actually has been a cover word during a certain time. Between 1800 and 1900, the Danes had something called Love of Your Country, which is a series of paintings and writings with a strong sense of loving your own country, which is only strengthened by losing half of Jutland in 1964. What did that achieve? That's my question to Mr. Bonky and anyone else familiar with the subject is, why was that done? What was the purpose of that? What was the outcome likely to be? And why did people want to think like that? Did people want to think like that? Or did the government want you to think like that? And what was the outcome, or the desired outcome, I should say, of that type of thinking? Mulhernator says, I'd say that there are desirable genetic traits that you want. There's no correlation between race and good genes. Okay, yeah, so, here's a question. This comes down to more humanity than nationalism, certainly, but should we allow people with disabilities to exist? If you ask certain extremists, you might say, they might say no, we should eliminate those people, whether that's through genetic manipulation or other more gruesome means. I think as a human race, though, we accept that certain people do have disabilities, and they're not as productive as people without certain disabilities. Not in all cases, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that you're going to have a harder time living if you lose your legs or you're born without legs than somebody who has both of their legs, right? I think most of us would agree, I hope at least, that you can support these people, or you can at least fit them into society. They might not even need support, Some disabilities do, and some don't. But and it's a question, a very difficult question. If we have the ability to eradicate, let's take Down syndrome, for example. If we have the ability to genetically eradicate that in unborn fetuses, should we do that? Can Down syndrome ever be a good thing? There's very little to, if you ask most people with the condition, I'm sure they wish that they didn't have it. But does that give us the right as human beings to just eliminate it? Interesting question. Not necessarily related to nationalism, but we're on the subject. Eugenics is despised and found with disgust these days, says Thready. Yes, exactly. But isn't that eugenics, what we're talking about here? Wiping out a specific disease because we can. What do you term a disease? What if we decided that everybody with dark hair? What if we decided that that was a disease? We'll eradicate all of those, you know? We'll genetically manipulate you so that you all have blonde hair. Does that seem reasonable? Where do you draw the line? What's a disease? And what is just the way you are, you know? Down syndrome isn't an inherited trait, says Mulhernator. You'd have to undergo pre-implantation genetic testing. Down syndrome is a trisomy, which is accidental error in the production of sex cells that means the child gains an extra chromosome. Oh yeah, but you'd be able to tell in a fetus, would you not? I'm not, Mulhernator is actually studying the biological sciences, so he knows a great deal more about this than I do. So I'm assuming that in a fetus you could do something. So let's just say we had the technology to do that. Should we? That's the question. And coming back to Mr. Bonke and his nationalism in the 19th century in Denmark, he says that the nationalistic view during 1800s in Denmark was that it strengthened and actually made us work very hard. We recreated our economy after losing half of our land, but at the cost of Danish superiority. I'm sure if we had a larger army at the time, we'd have gone to war. Danish view of superiority where we were actually inferior. Actually inferior. So, can nationalism make you work harder? That's the question. And we'll come on to that as well in a little bit more detail later. Yeah, so to Mulhernator, going back to that subject is of, you know, if we could eradicate something like Down syndrome, should we? He says in a fetus you'll be able to tell, I think in IVF, in vitro fertilization treatment, you can choose to discard some embryos that would be severely ill. And we're on to the subject of ethics here. So let's come back to the subject at hand here. With one last comment there from Mr. Thready, who says, you have to take into account many people make money and have a living helping out people with learning disabilities and disabilities in general. Well, that's a good point. Like, if nobody had any disabilities, what would happen to the support healthcare industry? But would that be a bad thing? Is that a broken window fallacy, you know? If you don't know that one, look it up, it's a good one. Schiff says that would mean killing people. I'm highly against that. Fair enough. So let's have a look at nationalism post-World War II. Up until the Second World War, nationalism was on the rise. After the devastation of the war, it took somewhat of a back seat. Because, you know, everybody saw in Nazi Germany the destruction that could come out of a highly nationalistic and motivated people. But here's the thing, and you might call me cynical. Feel free to call me cynical. Politics is a method of government or a method of power that uses fear to maintain control over people and to maintain that power. All right? If you don't have a fear among your people that something will happen unless this party is in power, what power does that party have to stay there? We're saying, we are your political party. We can't do anything. Why would I vote for that? You know, if you say, we are your political party, we will fight against terrorism to protect you and everyone in this country, you got a reason to vote for them, right? That's how they stay in power. So, post-World War II, the communist threat emerged, and it was a good crutch for the political system in the West. you know, here's a threat. If you turn communist, everything's going to go to crap, and we're here to stop communism. And we saw that throughout the Cold War. And I don't know what that noise was. Interesting. We saw that throughout the Cold War anyway. Korea, Vietnam, the Cuban Missile Crisis was all a result of the spread of communism. Hey! Thanks for the follow, Thready. 3030? Breaking news down the bottom there. Much appreciated. So, communism as a global ideology died in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. It took some years to finally end its death throes, and there are still some communist nations today. But as a global ideology, politics still needs an enemy against which they protect their people. So like I'm saying, why would you vote for a particular party if they can't do anything for you? And what's a better way to suggest that I can do something for you than protect you against something? Mulhernator says some political parties tend to operate on a more optimistic outlook. Yeah. Absolutely. Promise new change and prosperity. But it all comes down to the same thing. And like I said, call me cynical, if you like. But it is. It is the battle of this country's people against some threat. Yeah? Before World War II, the threat was, oh, look at these other nations. They're going to fight us. We're going to protect you. After World War II, we're going to protect you against communism. After communism, we are going to protect you against terrorism. These people need a common threat to unite the people and make them all vote together. Yeah? Mulhernick is saying as well that communism is the second most prevalent ideology of terrorists worldwide. Define terrorist. If I was a radical Islamist, would I not see American government as terrorism? Certainly think that's plausible. Mr. Bonky says, I believe in a scenario where a political party says everything is fine would create a hate towards the government. Because everything is fine, why bother paying people to do nothing? That's true. But then look at what in Britain we're paying our politicians for, you know. George Osborne, former Chancellor, is now a newspaper editor. So he's a member of a political party who edits a particular newspaper and gets paid a lot of money to do it. So why is he able to do that? Why are we paying him out of our taxes to have a job as a member of parliament, you know, a politician, when he's able to have another job as well, and one which lends itself to political bias? That's the question. What if they run out of common enemies to make a fear out of? I doubt this would happen, but would a government then create their own threat? Well, don't you think that's what's happened? I would argue that's what's happened. There's no more threat of communism, really. So let's look at terrorism as a threat, you know? Was that not just created? I mean, how many people die from... Let's take it... I'm going to pick on Islam again. Islamic extremists, which is not the whole of Islam by any stretch of the imagination. It's a tiny proportion. If you look at the reports, this is quite an important fact. The reporting in American media of the number of people killed by terrorism versus the amount of coverage it gets on the television, on websites, in newspapers, it is highly skewed. I'm not saying that nobody ever dies of terrorism. You know, 9/11, tragic incident, lots of people died. But it's 3,000 people. Yeah? 30,000 people died in Africa today from poverty. Where's that in the news? They will do the same tomorrow, yesterday, next week, every day. It doesn't sell papers. It doesn't sell headlines. That's why we don't hear about it, you know? Well, we can have the same headline every day. 30,000 people died in Africa. It's tragic, it is. That's 10 times as many people as died in the Twin Towers, and not to take anything away from those people who tragically died on September the 11th. But people are dying all over the place, you know? Is terrorism really that big a problem compared to the amount of news coverage it gets? Mulhernator says, I think my neighbour's a dirty Trotskyist. Keeps trying to nationalise my chicken coop. Ha. Okay. So, after the Second World War, there was a movement to unite Europe. So everybody was kind of sick of all this violence. As you would be. You'd had 2 world wars, you know, in the space of 35 years. That's pretty crazy. I mean, most people alive in the First World War would have been around for the Second World War and think, not again, this is terrible, you know? This eventually culminated in 1993 with the Maastricht Treaty and the foundation of the EU. I mean, there was a notion of an EU before then, but that was the formalization of a common Europe. The feeling in the 20th century was definitely that we're stronger united than we are divided. We should work together as a common continent. Apologies if you're not from Europe and you don't know too much about the EU. I'm focusing on this one issue because lately there has been a movement away from this unity. What happened? You know? Mulhernacy said, I think extremism is a growing threat, considering Al-Qaeda manual has been downloaded 50,000 times in this country. Okay. I read Mein Kampf, you know? I'm not a Nazi. I don't really want to... I'm not a Nazi, honest. Oh. Probably shouldn't do that. I read it because I was interested to see how Hitler came to the delusions that he arrived at, you know? Downloading something 50,000 times doesn't mean you create 50,000 extremists. Some of them will be. How many? Can't really say, you know? Mein Kampf is of an important historical context, says Mulhernator. Yes, you're right. And Thready says he looked up the Al-Qaeda manual 2 days ago. I don't think someone who's a member of Al-Qaeda would necessarily be in Twitch chat. Well, I don't know. He might be. Thready. Look a bit dodgy to me. No, I'm only joking. You know, you never know why people download those. It's a manual on how to kill Westerners. Okay. Of course it is. I'd read that. Not because I want to kill Westerners. Because I want to understand. I want to understand what's going through the mind of somebody who would write something like that. You know? I mean, I probably won't download it because the internet in this country is heavily monitored and probably get someone coming to my door. But I would be interested to read that. I think the moment that you rule out all political discussion, all ideological discussion, and just focus on what you determine safe political ideological discussion, is the moment when you lose sight of the big picture. Right? So I don't think Nazism is a particularly good idea. I think hopefully it's more or less died, and it should stay that way. But if somebody comes to me with another political opinion and says, hear me out, I need to make my point, what do? Do I say, you're talking about killing people, I'm not going to listen to you? Or do I say, I'm going to hear you out, and then I'm going to tell you why I think your argument is wrong? And that's the nature of intellectual, sensible debate, I believe. High Priest makes the good point that 50 years the Al-Qaeda manual might be considered important historical context. Possibly, yeah. Mr. Bonky says, terrorist manuals can be dangerous too if easily available. As many people easily influenced, they might not become extremists or terrorists themselves by reading, but possibly they could in some way support it. Interesting. Feel free to, moderator, Mr. Bonky, the moderator, to put some of these ideas over in that box. He has the power to do so. I don't, but he does. Have you seen a video where they have hidden camera footage showing private Muslim schools? Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to curb the discussion on Islamic extremism. I'm going to focus on nationalism here. We might well come back to do another topic, and I will be asking at the end what topics you'd like to see on this show in the future. I've got a few ideas of my own, but I'm sure you guys have better ones. We could go on all day about that, and I know it's a hot issue. But let's come back to nationalism as a whole. Why are countries looking to leave the EU? Why does Britain want to be independent? Does it want to be independent? I mean, the vote was 52, roughly, to 48, nationally. If you look at Scotland, practically the entirety of Scotland wanted to remain in the EU, most of Wales, most of Northern Ireland, and it was England that swayed the vote, outside of London. So, Mr. Bonky, anything that you think interesting, or worth instant sort of discussion, can go in that box. I've done it again. It's the wrong way. That way. anything like that. It's an interesting topic, though. Why are we suddenly seeing a rise in nationalism? I don't mean since last week. I mean in the 21st century. Z-Wolf's arrived in chat as well. Welcome to the live chat, Z-Wolf. Why is some nationalism, such as British, considered good, and some, such as Scottish, considered bad? Both have the same goals. Depends who's considering it good. I mean, look at the effects of British nationalism and empire building. We messed up India, messed up Africa, took a bunch of slaves to the Caribbean, profited from it. Is that good? Are certain aspects of it good? Probably. Is all of it good? No. Why is Scottish nationalism bad, you know? If most people in a particular state want independence, should we grant it? Why not? You know, last time, there was a referendum in Scotland and they chose not to be independent. So, that was the will of the people. And I was actually surprised to see that result. I honestly thought that Scotland would be going independent at that time. I think after the Brexit vote, I think it's clear that Scotland does want to be in the EU. And if their independence means that they can stay in the European Union, then Scotland will go independent to ensure that happens. You know? Mulhernator says he gets slightly defensive over the slavery issue. Slavery existed pretty much forever before Britain became the first major nation to ban it forever. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying it was just Britain, by any means, but slavery still exists very much today. Might not be in the same form as, you know, forcibly taking people from one continent to another in mass quantities and selling them. But it does exist. I also feel, says Mulhernator, as though those who caught slaves were a lot worse than those who traded them. It's a sticky subject. I think we might come back to that in another show. What I want to do right now is take a very short break. Do continue in chat to put forward your opinions, debate, discussion. And if you're watching the recorded version, I'm going to put a cut in here and you can come back for part 2. So, be back in about 5 minutes for you live viewers for more on nationalism. See you then.